Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. I've got Sergio Marchi with me again tonight. He's a former member of Parliament, former city councillor, former cabinet minister, and he's written a really provocative article called Under Trump's Shadow, Assessing the G7 in Kananaskis. And he says, despite mixed results, Prime Minister Carney displayed compelling leadership throughout while setting the stage for improved relations with the United States. The Honorable Sergio Marchi, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me, Brian. Pleasure.
My pleasure. So tell me, sir, why do you think, Trump left Kananaskis early, I think, to go do something in regards to the Israeli attacks on Iran's nuclear establishments, but it looked like he actually just went to raise two flags on the White House lawn. I'm not sure whether he really needed to leave or not. Maybe he was intimidated. And all the people that were flying in from around the world to meet him on the second day, there was no Donald Trump there. So why do you think that it was a success, and why do you think Prime Minister Carney showed leadership?
Yeah, on Trump leaving early, if you recall, 7 years ago, he left in a huff, and he left early, and then he slammed Trudeau, and he didn't sign the communique. There may be a legitimate reason why he needed to get back to the Situation Room with the Israeli-Iran conflict escalating. On the other hand, it could just be as simple that he gets bored with group meetings. He doesn't see the value of a G7 because he plays according to G1. It's only about America. So I can also see that he was bored out of his tree and not the most popular guy in the room. So exit to Washington. I guess we'll never really know, but it probably made Carney's job easier on the second day because the appearance of conflict went down. But you're right. The second day was all about the non-G7 leaders who were invited, and there was quite a group of them. And obviously, they must have been thoroughly disappointed without having the big guy there, especially those who had teed up bilateral meetings. So you look at a guy like Zelensky or the president of Mexico, they really were looking forward to a face-to-face, and obviously that went by the wayside. And I think it was mixed results. On the one hand, the good news was that our guy, Prime Minister Carney, I thought excelled in chairing. He was thorough. He was well organized and briefed. He's a smart guy. He was courteous. He indulged Trump's ego along the way. The bad news is that on some of the big ticket items, because of Trump, and that's why I alluded to the shadow of Trump, he thwarted the ambition of the group. So there was no statement on Ukraine, which is incredible, no statement on Gaza, no statement collectively on what tariffs are doing to the world economy, particularly for a club whose core mission is to make the global economy more stable. So when Trump forces your hand, you obviously take a hit. There's a cost for keeping him in check, and I think the G7 paid. So it was mixed results. Carney did issue some 7 separate issue-specific statements, so that was positive. But it was a mixed bag, if we're to be frank about it.
But I think in your article, you're suggesting that you think our new prime minister did a very good job. I think it's got to, and you probably know this better than almost anyone, it's got to be pretty challenging being a brand new newbie. Within a month of taking office, actually 2 months, I guess, because he was prime minister before he was elected. But within a month of being elected as prime minister, chairing a G7, that's got to be a little bit of a challenge, no?
Exactly. I said as much in that he didn't have much time to prepare for all the intricacies and personalities. But while he's a newbie to the world of politics, he's not a newbie when it comes to international meetings. And you can tell the kind of experience that he brings to bear with a confident chairmanship among his G7 colleagues. So I thought he got a lot of credit from everyone. I didn't see a single opinion that thought that Carney dropped the ball. On the contrary, he's getting accolades for having kept things together. But one of the biggest results, I think, for us, in addition to keeping his powder dry with Trump, so do no harm with the Orange Man, and he did that, as well from their face-to-face meeting, the leaders have asked for an agreement on both the tariff, trade, and the security platforms within 30 days. And so if they keep to that, and if it's a balanced deal, then that can be a very important outcome for our country.
I got to interrupt you. I got to interrupt you. 30 days. NAFTA took a year. The renegotiation of NAFTA took a long time, and numerous different visits and a lot of acrimony, where he still describes the lead negotiator, Chrystia Freeland, as toxic. So how is this going to possibly happen in 30 days? And not only are we talking about trade, we're talking about a recreation of NORAD, effectively, with the Golden Dome. Sir, you're experienced at this. How can this possibly happen within 30 days?
Yeah, it's not like they just started the morning after the G7 broke up. They've been talking trade between the two leaders, exchanging documents, and between the ministers. So it's been around. We had an election on this, of course. And so I think, who knows if Trump is going to keep it to 30 days. I can see Carney honoring it because he's a much more principled, organized guy, whereas Trump can change on the dime. The 30 days can become 30 months for all we know. But at least from Carney's perspective, he's now got the attention and the focus of the administration, because when the American boss says 30 days, his ministers can read English or understand what he means. And so I think this pushes the machinery forward. Now, is it going to be on day 30 or is it going to be on day 36? I don't know. But I'd like to think that it's possible, because if it's not, it only hurts Carney as well, because he's increased the expectations that we're going to get manna from heaven in 30 days. So I'd like to think that there's something to it if Carney agreed. Otherwise, why set yourself up for a fall?
And he talked about the benefit of a deadline in negotiations, and that focused everybody. And so I think that's helpful. But at the same time, the reality is Donald Trump and the senior people from a security standpoint in the United States are dealing with a war in the Middle East, a war in Eastern Europe. The Secretary of Defense says the biggest threat is China doing something in the South China Sea against Taiwan. So senior American security people, defense people, are a little bit preoccupied with some other issues. And they've got, 75, 135, I don't even know how many people he says are calling, trying to renegotiate trade relations with the United States. So the trade representative people have got a couple of other priorities as well. How can Canada or Canada and Mexico possibly be the top of the priority list?
I'm not sure we're at the top of the list, because you're right. I mean, there's multiple conflicts begging the attention of the Americans, and especially if Trump decides to get involved in the Iranian conflict, then that time is going to be even more reduced, because he's going to be completely preoccupied with that. So they're frying a lot of big fish. There's no question. And so again, is 30 days a realistic focus or not? That's what they came out with. That's the hope. But like you, if we miss the target, maybe it wasn't realistic in the first place. But when a president says, look, I agree with you, let's get it done in 30 days, the prime minister is not going to say no. Or the prime minister is not going to say, but aren't you busy with other files? I guess our prime minister says, good for us. If we can get the president to say 30 days, that's terrific. But how many people trust Trump's word these days? Not many. So
let me ask you about that.
Let's stay tuned.
Let me ask you about that, because you're obviously very experienced in politics, and also dealing with some difficult individuals. So some people have criticized Mark Carney for, number one, stroking the ego of the president, and saying you're showing leadership, when some people think he's actually not showing leadership. He's showing the opposite of leadership around the world. He's the problem. There's an article, a very strong article in the Globe and Mail this past weekend, about how Trump is the problem in the G7 and worldwide right now. And then second of all, tell me about what you think about Mark Carney standing up there at a press conference when Donald Trump blames your predecessor, Pierre Trudeau. Sorry, Freudian slip there. Justin Trudeau for kicking Putin out of the G7. When Putin was kicked out of the G7, Stephen Harper was actually the prime minister. No one corrected Trump. No one, in particularly Mark Carney, who knew better, said, I'm sorry, Mr. President, that's not right. Why don't you correct Donald Trump when he clearly is either lying or making a mistake?
Yeah. Well, on your first point, indulging the president, we know that if you indulge a president, you can have your way, and if you question him, you're framed just like Zelensky was in that infamous meeting at the Oval Office that I was just sick to my stomach to watch. But a little bit of indulging, I think, is okay. I think it's a bit of a sweetener. And like I said, it looks like they're beginning to create a relationship to the degree that you can have an honest relationship with this guy, because he doesn't care about anything except him in America. But it seems that Trump is certainly much more agreeable to working with Carney than with Trudeau. Obviously, that was a toxic relationship. But you're right. I mean, he blamed it on Trudeau when it was during Harper's regime, and I guess we should have questioned him, but I guess Carney kowtowed to him. The question is, how much of kowtowing are you going to do? It's not right if you do it always as a matter of policy. But as you touched on, Trump is the problem. When you put 7 people together in the room, 6 of them on most issues see eye to eye. And then you get the 7th, who happens to be the most powerful of the group, that doesn't. So how can the G7 sustain itself during Trump's political time in office when he's the odd man out? How are they going to do NATO in a few days when this guy is closer to Putin than he is to most NATO allies? It's a huge problem because Trump doesn't see the world like most other reasonable leaders do. And so either you kowtow to him or you challenge him. And if you challenge him, the pieces will fall apart. So how would that have looked if there was a blowout and the G7 would have been a bust? How will the world take advantage of their senior leaders being in complete disarray? So I don't blame him for being quiet at strategic moments, but you can't do that all of the time. Otherwise, he becomes a bigger problem than he already is.
We're going to take a break for some messages and be back in just 2 minutes with the Honorable Sergio Marchi, former cabinet minister in the federal government, very involved in politics at all levels, someone who knows a lot about politics and about international relations, about what's going on. He's written a really interesting article about the G7 summit. When we come back, I'm going to ask him about leadership, and I'm going to ask him about is the G7 still relevant? Stay with us, everyone. Back in just 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. I've got the Honorable Sergio Marchi with me today. Honorable Sergio Marchi, you've been involved in politics for quite a while, have you not?
Yeah, it shows by age, doesn't it?
But also by experience.
I joined politics as a young man in another world.
So tell everyone a little bit about your background, please.
Well, I became active in politics on the strength of having been very active in the community during all of late high school and all of my university days. I was extremely involved. I was editor of a local newspaper. I was president of a youth club. I became a ratepayer president, and I loved it. I was completely taken by being involved and fighting City Hall, as it were, much to the chagrin of my parents, who, as immigrants, wanted me to focus on my studies and not on volunteer work. It was very difficult for me to tell them why I was getting such a pleasure from this voluntary work, which was a little foreign to them at the time. And then on top of that, my marks were sliding because I wasn't paying as much time and effort to the school side as I was to the community. And then they would scratch their hair and say, well, if you're going to work out in the community and if your marks are going to slide, why aren't you at least getting paid for it? So I'm sure that when I go to bed and the two of them were still up at night, they talk about what a nothing their son would become. But I love the community work, and I was studying to be an urban planner. But at the end, I said to myself, I'd rather continue some kind of community-related work than pure planning. And that's where politics came in. I ran the campaign for the mayor of Sault Ste. Marie in the 1980 election, Ron Irwin. He invited me once we won to be his assistant in Ottawa. I did that for 2 years. And then I came back to Toronto, arguably to do my master's in urban planning as a bit of a security blanket. And I ended up instead running municipally for a councillor seat, and I was fortunate enough to win. And so that was the background. My entry to politics was pure and simple. It was love for the community, serving the community. I ran in the community that I went to school in, both in high school and grade school, and where my parents and I lived. So for me, it was a natural progression.
So you spent time on Toronto City Council, and then you ran and got elected as a member of Parliament, and spent time in Parliament, and then you got appointed to cabinet. But still today, you're involved. I've had the honor of having you on my show. You've been in other media. You're writing articles. Why still be involved today?
It's not because politics is necessarily addictive, but because I view politics as important. Some people just hate politics and all the politicians that come with it. I see politics as one important piece to guaranteeing a good future. When you look at a number of countries around the world, take, for example, where I was born, Argentina. Argentina, when my dad emigrated there after the war, was seen as being ahead of Canada economically by most observers. A big country like Canada is as well, but it also had natural resources, arable land, Western European migration and labor. And so they were a country that couldn't miss, and they did. In my opinion, they never turned the corner, and which is why my parents decided to leave Argentina. They just saw Canada after 10 years in Argentina much more promising. But the biggest problem for why they missed the corner was bad governance, corruption, lack of independence in institutions. And as a result of that, Argentina tanked while Canada continued to grow. So I view politics as a real necessity, good governance as a necessity. And I'm really concerned, Brian, that because politics is becoming more polarized and divided and nasty, many people who would otherwise want to give something back are giving it a pass, especially young people. And I've taught in a number of universities, and most of the students are down on politicians and politics, and therefore very few hands go up when I say, how many of you want to go or consider a public life? Maybe out of 25 in the class, 2-3 hands go up. So I'm very concerned about that, to the point that I'm actually now writing a book about how to encourage young Canadians into public service and explaining the different steps and issues in order to be successful. So I'd like to contribute my 2 cents worth. I know I've had a good run. I know I'm not in office. So I do write from time to time. I do teach from time to time, because I really believe public life goes hand in hand with a good, viable country.
Well, I think we should have you back to talk about that topic at some point in time, because I think it's critical. Turnout in election campaigns has gone down dramatically, even worse provincially, even much worse
municipally. As you know, you ran, yeah.
We have 20 to 30% turnout if we're lucky in elections municipally. That said, in the last election, supposedly young male turnout increased, and it increased for Pierre Poilievre and the Conservatives. So that's an interesting juxtaposition to this conversation, and maybe worthy of a conversation. But let's turn back to the G7 if we could. And I want to ask you: is it still relevant? If Donald Trump likes bilateral relations, and would much prefer to be one-on-one with other people. Number two, if he thinks that Putin and Xi from China should be at the G7, when the G7, I thought, was supposed to be democratic countries that were the most sizable economic democratic countries were supposed to be there. And then the next day, it almost became the G dozen with people from South Africa and Ukraine and India and Mexico coming for an attendance. Is the G7 still relevant? Some people are thinking it should be the G6, exclude U.S. Some people, Donald Trump, think it, should be bilateral relations. Some people think it should be the G something or other. Prime Minister Paul Martin, who you know well, thought the G20 was the more effective organization. What's your sense? Is the G7 still relevant?
There's a lot of observers in recent years that have been asking that question, because they look at the G7 and they say, okay, our percentage or share of GDP globally is going down. As we're going down, there's a core group of strong developing countries that are coming up economically and politically. You mentioned the G20, that almost serves as some competition. And at some G7 summits, there's more talking than there is doing. So it's legitimate to raise the relevancy question. It's legitimate to pose the question, as we both have, what happens for another 3.5 years while Trump is still the president and he goes to the G7 and the NATOs and blocks that ambition? I don't think we should reward Putin for his behavior by inviting him back. I don't know why Trump is so emphatic about doing that. But I think it's also a good idea, at least in one of the 2 days, to invite non-G7 members, because I think it makes the engagement much more realistic. In other words, how can you talk economically without having some of these other countries in the room? So I think there's some real plumbing issues that they need to address as we go forward. But I'd have to say that it's still relevant. Whenever you take among the 7 most powerful leaders in countries and put them in a place for 2.5 days, just the relationship bonus is huge. I've been with Prime Minister Chrétien to meet a number of world leaders, and I can tell you how important the relationship building part is. It's not a political spin to say that, because after every meeting where you discuss the formal business, then the leaders kick back. Then they'll have a drink. They will talk politics. They will talk about their family. Some will light up a cigar. Then they'll have a nice dinner. Sometimes their wives are included. And all of a sudden, you see the bonds being created. So if at the meeting, the formal business doesn't all get done, it eventually has a chance of getting done because the rapport and the bonds are very healthy. So especially for a first-timer like the UK Prime Minister and our Prime Minister, to sit down and spend 72 hours with some of the most powerful people in the world, I think the relationship value far exceeds saying, well, it's irrelevant on the substance, we think, so let's close it down. I think we would lose something. And again, not every year are you going to score big. There's going to be some years where there's going to be less done. And then in another summit, things change. But from a relationship, from talking, from collaborating, from cooperating, you can't beat face-to-face for building those bonds. So I would argue for it to continue, but we definitely need some plumbing to be fixed so that it can produce better poetry.
I thought the picture of the Prime Minister of the UK and our Prime Minister in the bar watching the Oilers Florida game the night before was brilliant. Do you think that was actually a real conversation, or was it just a photo op of them having a beer?
Oh, I think there's a real conversation around a beer and watching hockey. It's like, I remember when Obama visited Canada, and Trudeau took him to a local hangout in Montreal. They had the room to themselves. They had beer and they had food. And while they're eating, they're talking. Now, not all of it is going to be on policy, not all of it on politics. Some is personal, but that time together, Brian, I've seen it in action with Chrétien and Blair, with Chrétien and Clinton, with Chrétien and Chirac, and you can go down the list. Schroeder at the time in Germany, really backslapping by the end of the evening, and that you can't put a price on, because then when the world blows up, it makes it far easier for Chrétien to pick up the phone to talk to Schroeder or to Blair or to Clinton. And that's one of the biggest values that I take out of this last G7. And kudos to Carney, because he invited a lot of non-G7 actors, not just for the G7, but, you know, if we're going to depend less on the United States and build our relationships internationally, this was a great start by inviting India. He took a risk. I agree with that. Why can't we have Modi in town for 24 hours without upsetting the RCMP investigation? You can do both on both tracks, sends out the message that we want to regularize our relationships. I support that. He did the same thing with Saudi Arabia, who, you know, the crown prince has, you know, been accused of having a hand in killing Khashoggi, the former journalist from the United States, in 2018. But he took a chance at inviting him to send the message that we want to break that logjam. We want to talk again. And I think, again, the relationships part, be it where I think he pushed forward our relationship with Trump a couple of inches over the G7, and he certainly did that with all those new leaders. He had almost 20 bilaterals during those 72 hours. That's going to pay. We're going to see the dividends of that.
Many people criticized his invitation to the Prime Minister Modi from India coming, given that it would appear that he and the RCMP, or at least the prior government and the RCMP, believed that the Indian government had a role in assassinating somebody on Canadian soil, a Canadian citizen on Canadian soil. Particularly Sikh members of Canada thought that it was completely inappropriate to invite Modi to the G7, given the situation. What's your sense of that?
I agree with Carney's decision. I think it took a bit of guts. I think it was a risk that was worth taking, because here you've got now the most populous country in the world. They surpassed China. They're a huge and growing economic force. We haven't had a bilateral like that in 2 years. Our relationship has been in the deep freeze. Yes, admittedly, there's the accusation by the RCMP that the Indian government was guilty. And I don't have a lot of personal time for Modi or his personal leadership. I think he's a negative, divisive force back in India. That's my humble opinion. But what do we do then? Do we isolate India? And if we do, for how long? And who is it going to hurt? Is it going to hurt India, where the world is going to go there and do their business, or is it going to hurt Canada? And so I think isolation never works. If you want to get away from the United States orbit, you have to include the Indian market. And at the same time, hopefully this process, this RCMP process, will go on uninterrupted by those 24 hours. So I think it was a case of walking and chewing gum, and I support that.
The Prime Minister of France, Macron, visited Greenland on his way over. Is that a slap in the face of Trump? Was it a mistake for him to go do that so publicly, or do you think that was a smart move?
I liked it. I think he had a bit of balls, if I can say that on air, to do that. He wasn't there very long, but the message was very, very clear, and he didn't over push it. He went there. He was soft pedaling, but the message was loud and clear, and that's probably one of the reasons why when Macron, after Trump left, said, "Oh, he's going back to do a ceasefire," And Trump basically said, what does he know? He's only after the media. So he probably was irritated by that Greenland. But that's what I mean. You can't always kowtow to Trump or else he'll become even a bigger, more brutal dictator than he is. He's an elected dictator. That's what the states are living under. Now you see a stream of articles on autocracy, right? It's there already. So I think from time to time, you got to take the stick to the bear. And so I support the move that the French president did on coming and stopping in Greenland. I endorse that.
Mark Carney has been having direct conversations with Mexico and invited Mexico to attend the summit as well. Is that ganging up against Trump and the United States?
No, I think that's an opportunity which was missed because Trump wasn't there for when the Mexican president was there on the second day. Had Trump stayed, I was hopeful that a trilateral meeting could have taken place between the three of them. I don't think it's ganging up on Trump. It's a question of saying, look, the three of us are in the same town at the same time. Let's get together. We have to renegotiate this by next year. What does the path look like? What do you say? What do you think? What are our timelines? So I don't think it was a ganging up. But again, because Trump left, the Mexican president was not able to do a one-on-one, although just to show the importance and the fact that he wasn't upset, Trump called her while she was in Kananaskis. So at least she had some time with the big man. But I think the three of them in a room for 20, 30 minutes would have been a help to figuring things out as opposed to a gang up.
Did anyone else, particularly impress you? I, for one, was impressed with Italy. She's very charismatic. She seemed very personable, very comfortable, and that she probably connected with people. And I was a little bit surprised by that, given that her politics are thought of to be so right wing.
Yep. No, I think you're right. I share your opinion. She's very smart. She's astute. She speaks very good English for an Italian politician. And she does have charisma, and she's being seen as the person that has perhaps stepped into the void of Angela Merkel, where she is well seen in Europe. She tries to maintain her rapport with Trump, so it's a tricky balance. But yeah, she's very charismatic and very intelligent, photogenic as well. And so she's got what it takes to become more than just the leader of Italy. She can clearly become a pivotal captain for Team Europe, no question.
We're chatting with the Honorable Sergio Marchi about the G7 summit in Kananaskis. We're going to take a break for some messages and come back in just 2 minutes. And I'm going to ask him a tough political partisan question when we come back and see what he has to say about this. Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. I've got the Honorable Sergio Marchi with us tonight talking about the G7 summit in Kananaskis. Maybe it was the G6, maybe it was the G, 12, 15, something like that the next day. It was an interesting summit. I think, Sergio, that many Canadians watched and were very impressed with Mark Carney. I think his prior relationship with the president of France, the prime minister of the UK, probably helped him. His experience with the Bank of Canada, the Bank of England, obviously helped him because he's been in a lot of these roles previously. And he showed, as I think you pointed out in your article, and you've talked about today, leadership. Let me ask you a question in that regard. How do you think Pierre Poilievre would have done if he was chair of this G7?
That's interesting. We'll never know for sure, but I think that's one of the reasons why I think Carney won the election, despite having been behind for so long as a party. And Canadians saw the real adult in the room. And I think the question about Poilievre, besides his character and unlikability, which I think is a huge problem for the Conservative Party, is that he's not steeped in international relations. He's not steeped in global affairs. He doesn't know the leaders around the world. So who knows how he would have done? I mean, Poilievre is a smart individual, but I don't think he would have mastered the art of chairing a G7 with a month after the election as Carney did. I think what you saw in Carney was the experience kicking in of him having been around the G7 table before, not as a minister or not as prime minister, but as a senior bureaucrat. You see the experience of having run the Bank of Canada in England in the way he speaks and his composure. He doesn't get rattled. So what you saw there was the benefit of experience, which Poilievre does not have. And I would think anybody who's paying attention to looking at the G7 must have come away impressed with Carney as they were impressed with him during the election. He seems, Brian, to be built for these times. He almost relishes the challenge. If we were living in regular, boring times, maybe Carney would not have made the prime ministership after the election. People would have turned to someone else. But during these tough times, I think Carney stood taller by his performance. And we saw that at the G7. And I think his currency will only go up after performances like that. When he goes to France next year for the G7, he goes not only as a prime minister of Canada, but someone who quickly handled the Canadian Kananaskis version very well. So people will seek him out, not necessarily Trump, but the other leaders. I'm absolutely positive about it.
I think that Pierre Poilievre is probably the best leader of an opposition that we've ever had. The man is sort of, as you talked about, Carney being made for the current situation. I think Pierre Poilievre was made for opposition. Am I wrong, though? And I just can't imagine him playing the role that Carney played. I just can't imagine him in the role of chair of the G7. And am I being partisan in that, or do you think that as actually a realistic opinion?
I don't think it's partisan to say what you actually believe and what you actually see, which is why, as I said, Canadians did not go with Poilievre despite some real challenging
came within
times.
2 points winning.
Yeah, but they were 25 points ahead as well. So I think that Poilievre, as you said, is a very effective opposition leader. When you see him in action, he doesn't have to read a note. He's very very good at communications. He's great at the 30-second. The problem with Poilievre is his likability or his snarkiness, or he gets personal with people. He uses slogans. And what happens then is you tune out because you get tired of the shtick day in and day out. So, for example, the other night,
good home on a safe street, protected by. I've heard that so many times.
You can memorize it to death. But Carney, after the vote in the House of Commons supporting the infrastructure bill, what did he do? He got up and he walked across the aisle and shook the hands of Andrew Scheer, the acting leader in the House, while Poilievre is trying to get himself elected in safe Alberta riding. He shook a number of hands. Now, would Poilievre have done that? No, he's just too brutal of a political guy. And so Carney is elegant. Carney is reassuring. He's courteous. He's actually comes across as a nice guy. Tough to work for, I hear. A tough boss. He demands a lot, which is good because I think a lot of people will be demanding a lot from Carney. But he's a different cat, much more likable, much more experienced, much smarter, especially globally speaking. So if Poilievre is good at opposition, then maybe he can stay there for a while.
Maybe I should ask you about his hiring of Michael Sabia. I think he's clerk of the Privy Council or something like that now, who comes from Hydro-Quebec, comes from the Caisse de dépôt, comes from a long history of sort of technocratic leadership within Quebec and Canada. Maybe has sort of an industrial policy perspective or history. a very senior, experienced bureaucrat. Is that the right decision?
I think it was a first-rate appointment. I agree with your evaluation of Sabia. Michael's had a long, distinguished career in public service and in the private sector. He's got a sharp mind. And one of the things he said just before getting appointed, which I like a lot, is that Canada is running an ambition deficit. In other words, we need to be more ambitious. We need to grab for the stars. And this is a moment where we need to do that, because if we're going to rebuild our economy, if we're going to move away from America, if we are going to build those big projects which we used to build but don't anymore, then it's going to take an ambitious vision. And so what I see is that the Prime Minister is one ambitious cat in articulating what he has in the election and since. And now you've got a clerk who's going to match him on that ambition and match him on that experience and smart public policy mind. So I think the two of them coming together, I think is brilliant. We'll have to see in the delivery of that. But I haven't seen one person be critical of Michael Sabia's appointment. Everybody has said, wow, he doesn't need this, as he's now, 70, 71. But he's doing it because I think he's convinced that Carney is the real thing. And so I think Carney's just got a huge tool in Sabia that he's going to benefit from.
The next summit is the NATO summit coming up this week. And, I think our Prime Minister has committed Canada to reaching the 2% of GDP defense spending next year. But all of a sudden, NATO's talking about increasing it to 3.5% and or 5% if you include some defense infrastructure expenditures. Tell me what you think Mark Carney's challenge is and what he should be doing at the NATO summit.
Well, I think the fact that he's rushed the 2% from where we've been traditionally, I think it's gotten to a point during Trudeau's time that hurt us in terms of credibility. The fact that it was taking us forever to get to 2%. And I was in government too when Mr. Chrétien didn't get to the 2%, because I get it. People want their money spent locally as opposed to globally in terms of international defense commitments. But I think it hurt our credibility. So I think Carney gets some real bonus marks for having accelerated that. But now there's going to be a new challenge. So just at the moment you get to 2%, they raise the bar to 3.5, and with infrastructure, perhaps 5. So the challenge is still there, but I think he's going in there a lot stronger. If he didn't do that move, I think we would have been suspect among the group of NATO, as it were. I think he's got his admission, and we'll see how he frames the 3.5 or the 5%. He said, I don't support throwing general targets out there without a rationale. So what's the rationale to go to 3.5? So at least he's in the door, and he can take his mask off, and we'll see how people react to the new one. I mean, the 3.5, many NATO countries aren't at 3.5. So it's going to be a challenge for them as well. America is at 3.5. And so that's the highest. And so it's not surprising that Trump has put 3.5, because they're already doing it. But most others aren't. So we're going to still be in good company, if I can say that, a critical mass of NATO not having gone beyond the 2%. But at least now we've joined the rest of the pack.
Prior Liberal governments have not agreed to join into a North America-wide missile defense shield. Now our Prime Minister is saying that he'll join or potentially join this Golden Dome strategy, which is really a huge reconfiguration of NORAD and the idea of NORAD. What do you think of that?
I'm not sold on this Golden Dome. I've heard this or seen this movie before. Trump throws out $60 billion price admission. Then a few days ago, he said it was 70 billion. So A, it's a lot of money. B, is the technology going to work? And C, is Carney just playing for time? In other words, rather than saying a brutal no to the Trump administration, is he trying to gild the lily and maybe at the end of it, for whatever reason, say that we're not going to go in? But I'm very skeptical about this. I don't know if this is for real or one of many other ideas that Trump raises every morning he wakes up. He's just throwing things out. But I'm skeptical.
Israel has attacked the nuclear infrastructure, or at least starting to attempt to attack the nuclear infrastructure in Iran, as well as other military installations around Iran. The president of the United States has said he's going to decide whether he gets involved within 2 weeks. Some people think that it's a B-2 bomber with a big, huge bomb that can destroy the nuclear facility. Others think that that's not safe, and the only way to do it is with ground forces. You worked for Prime Minister Kretschmer when he decided not to go into Iraq. If there are ground forces involved and NATO and or Canada is asked to be involved, what do you think Canada's response should be, sir?
Well, I know that Kretschmer took many accolades about Iraq because he didn't sense or believe the intelligence that said they had mass weapons of mass destruction, and in the end, they didn't, and they caught Saddam like a dog in a hole after the invasion. But Iraq now is very different from Iran. Iran is a breeding ground for terrorism. They'll support the most extreme positions of other entity like Hamas, and they do their proxy work for Iran. So I think Iran is a real geopolitical nuisance. And if they get their hands on a nuclear device, then that can be extremely dangerous and unpredictable. So as much as I dislike the killing of or the deaths of 50,000 Gazans under the rubric of getting to Hamas. I mean, the October 7th incident was awful. They treated those victims like animals. But what are you going to say about the loss of 50,000 deaths? But notwithstanding that, I support Israel in trying to take out the nuclear capability, or at least set them back for years. I'm not an expert in that domain, but if we believe what we read, then they really caused some damage and retarded the timeline for them getting a weapon. And I think the Iranian regime is weak. I think you can see them almost having begged Trump to call Netanyahu to call the incursions off. So I support that because I believe Iran has been one huge destabilizing force. And if we can neutralize it, again, there's obviously the possibilities of the crisis getting out of hand. But if we can neutralize Iran, we may have made the world a little safer.
Many people think the only way you neutralize them is with regime change. They think that the government is a not a theocracy but a dictatorship. That the mullahs aren't religious. That they're there for power, and it's an oligopoly or a situation very similar to what you've got in Russia. That there's incredible corruption, etc. But as debates in the U.S. Senate this past week indicated, the issue with regime change is what do you do the day after? In Afghanistan, what was it, 20 years? In Iraq, it was not quite as long, but almost as long. Do you support regime change in Iran, and particularly if that means a long-term involvement by the the United States or NATO or peacekeepers or whoever?
Yeah, that's obviously a very tricky question. It's one thing to take out their nuclear capability, which I support. It's another thing taking out their leaders, which would come from the Iranian people. Now, many Iranians are applauding this move because there's no love lost between the average Iranian and the regime. I was in Tehran some 10, 12 years ago, very rare for a Canadian, but I went there as part of a group. And I tell you, the meetings that we had with Iranian businessmen, NGOs, they are just cheering the West in order to get rid of the group of mullahs who have no concern other than their own. The problem in Iran right now is if you take out the current leader, who steps in? In other words, is there a natural heir apparent who's somewhat more democratic? It's not like in a country where if you look at Venezuela, and you've got an active opposition. You've got an opposition that, for all intents and purposes, won the last election, except the fact that Maduro corrupted the election procedures. So if you take out Maduro, you have an opposition, you have faces, you have personalities to organize around. Right now in Iran, maybe it's silent and we don't see it, but right now a vacuum can be very dangerous because who steps into it? Who's going to step into it the morning after? And as Colin Powell, the former five-star general, says, if you break it, you own it. And that's what happened in Iraq, right? We went in there to free people and we ended up owning that big mess. And Chrétien looked very good by staying out. So I think the two are very different issues. If I was Israel, I would concentrate on taking out their nuclear capabilities. And if a byproduct of that is that the Iranian people rise up and choose someone differently, maybe that could be the spark plug, but that should not be the rationale, in my humble opinion.
Last question, sir. Our prime minister says that we're going to be the fastest growing economy in the G7. Do you believe him? And are you optimistic, or is that just political statements?
Well, I think, you got to target high to go places. And, the danger in saying we're going to be the fastest growing is you got to live up to it. And if you're not the fastest growing, you take a hit on expectations. And I've been in politics and I know the role that expectations play. So there's a risk that Carney is saying, we're going to build big projects, build, baby, build. We're going to build the best economy in the G7. We're going to restructure our trade alliances with the United States. Those are mighty big ticket items. And you have to deliver, because if you miss on all of them or most of them, you look like a bum rather than like a hero. So I'd like to think that Carney is measured. So if he is confident that we can put in place policies and structures to make us that much more competitive in the G7, I'd like to believe him. But the $64,000 question is, can you deliver?
Honorable Sergio Marchi, thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate it. I thought your article was excellent. And I've enjoyed this discussion about the relevance of the G7, the leadership by our new Prime Minister, Mark Carney, the personal relationships that he's established and the importance of having those personal relationships, what you think is going to be happening or should happen in Iran, the trilateral negotiations we got to have with the U.S. and Mexico, the importance of making overtures to Modi and including him back in sort of the international economy. And we haven't chatted a lot about Ukraine, but, I think having Zelensky there, even though it didn't end up with a communique on Zelensky, I think the fact that they were all, the balance of the G7 supportive of Zelensky, meeting with him and indicating, continued support for the Ukrainian position in this war against Russia, I think was critically important. So I agree with you. I think that our prime minister did a great job. I think that Canada looked good. I think Kanaskis looked fantastic. And so thank you so much for coming on the show and talking about it, sir.
Well, it was a real pleasure. Thanks for having me. And I enjoyed the discussion as much as you did.
That's our show for tonight, everybody. Thank you for joining. I remind you, I'm on every Monday through Friday at 6 o'clock on 960 AM. You can stream online at saga960 saga960ca.ca. And all my podcasts and videos go up on my website, briancrombie.com, social media and podcast servers as soon as the radio show goes to air. Good night, everybody.